Hello, everyone. Tonight you are going to hear 20 true crime and historical stories, starting with a strange, dark, and unforgettable tale. The story is told in a slow, gentle voice inside a quiet, dark room while you lie back, relax, and listen. If you like stories like this, please hit the like button, subscribe, and let me know where you are listening from and what time it is right now. Before we start, please check your doors and windows. Maybe glance at any cameras you have and make sure you feel safe. Listen to the sound of the rain outside. It starts as a few heavy drops tapping against the glass, then settles into a steady, rhythmic drumming that wraps around the room like a heavy blanket. The smell of damp earth and wet pavement begins to seep in, mixing with the cool air. Against that backdrop of sound, this first story begins in the cramped, winding streets of London, England, in the year 1666. It was a time when the city was a tinderbox waiting for a spark, and the night began not with a scream, but with the smell of burning bread. Imagine standing on a cobblestone street and seeing a river of bright red liquid flowing toward you. It looks like lava from a volcano, but there are no mountains here. It is molten lead liquefying from the roof of the massive St. Paul's Cathedral and pouring down the gutters, sizzling as it hits the stones. The heat is so intense that the air itself feels solid, scorching your lungs with every breath. This was not a war zone or a divine punishment, but the result of a single small mistake made in a bakery on Pudding Lane just a few days prior. Thomas Farriner was the King's baker, a man who took pride in his work on Pudding Lane. On the night of September the 2nd, he did what he always did. He raked up the coals in his oven, ensuring the fire was out, and went up to bed. But London had been suffering from a long, dry summer. The wooden houses coated in pitch and tar were packed so tightly together that you could shake hands with your neighbour across the street from your upper window. A stray spark from Farriner's oven did not die. It found a pile of fuel, and in the silence of the night, it began to feed. By the time the sun rose, the fire was consuming the neighbourhood. The locals called for the Lord Mayor of London, Thomas Bloodworth, begging him to pull down the adjacent houses to create a fire break. This was the only way to stop a fire in a city built of wood. Bloodworth arrived, took one look at the burning homes, and made a decision that would doom the city. He famously shrugged and said a woman might piss it out. He refused the demolition order, not wanting to pay for the damages, and went back to his warm bed to sleep. The fire did not sleep. Driven by a strong easterly wind, it grew into a firestorm. It moved faster than a man could run, jumping from roof to roof. The streets became choked with people carrying their entire lives on their backs. Carts, furniture, and panicked animals blocked the narrow escape routes. The heat grew so intense that it created its own weather system, sucking in oxygen and feeding the flames until they roared like a living beast. The smoke was so thick, it turned day into night for miles around, choking the citizens who were trapped between the wall of fire and the river. Desperate for safety, thousands of people rushed to St. Paul's Cathedral. With its thick stone walls and high roof, they believed it was invincible. They stacked their furniture, books and goods inside the crypts and the churchyard. But the fire was relentless. It surrounded the great stone beast. The wooden scaffolding around the church caught fire first. Then the intense heat began to attack the roof itself. This is when the lead tiles dissolved raining liquid metal down onto the streets and sealing the fate of everything inside. The stones exploded like grenades. When the wind finally died down 4 days later, the silence that fell over London was terrifying. 80% of the city was gone. 13,000 houses, 87 churches, and the great cathedral were reduced to ash. The ground was too hot to walk on for days. Amazingly, the official death toll was recorded as only 6 people, though the true number of poor citizens who perished and left no trace was likely in the thousands. As for Thomas Farriner, the baker whose oven started it all, he denied responsibility until his dying day. London was rebuilt, rising from the ashes with wider streets and brick buildings designed by the great Christopher Wren. But there was a strange, grim silver lining to this tragedy. The fire had burned so hot and so thoroughly that it incinerated the dirty slums and the rats that lived within them. The Great Plague, which had killed nearly 100,000 people just the year before, virtually disappeared after the fire. The city had to die a violent death in order to be cleansed and born again. While the smoke was still clearing from the ashes of London, marking the violent end of a medieval era, a very different kind of construction was beginning just across the English Channel. If the fire in London was an accident that destroyed a city, the structure rising in France was a deliberate calculation to build a prison. But this was not a dungeon with iron bars and damp stone walls. It was a trap made of solid gold, endless mirrors and crushed velvet designed to capture the most dangerous people on earth. It is said that you could smell the King of France before you could see him. In the year 1682, walking down the marble corridors of the most expensive building in the Western world did not smell like fresh roses or expensive perfume. It smelled like a stagnant sewer. Beneath the heavy layers of white powder towering wigs and silk brocade, the air was thick with the undeniable stench of unwashed bodies and human waste, a rot hiding in plain sight within the lap of luxury. King Louis XIV, known to history as the Sun King, was a man haunted by his childhood. He'd grown up watching the French nobility rise up against the crown in a series of civil wars known as the Fronde. He had seen the chaos that powerful independent warlords could cause. He swore he would never let them threaten his power again. His solution was to look at a mosquito-infested swamp roughly 12 miles outside of Paris and decide to move the entire seat of government there. To the outside world, being invited to live at the Palace of Versailles was the ultimate honour. In reality, it was a logistical nightmare and a psychological torture chamber. Dukes and duchesses were forced to abandon their ancestral estates, where they were kings of their own little domains, to come and live under Louis's roof. They were packed into tiny, freezing attic rooms that were often smaller than the servants' quarters in their own castles. But they had no choice. If you were not at Versailles, you did not exist. Louis weaponized boredom and etiquette to strip these powerful men and women of their agency. He created a system of rules so complex that a wrong step could ruin your social standing forever. The day began with a ritual called Le Lever, the rising of the king. Hundreds of grown men, the peers of the realm, would crowd into the king's bedroom just to watch him wake up. They fought viciously for the privilege of holding the candlestick or handing the king his shirt. By making them compete for these trivial scraps of attention, Louis ensured they never had the time or unity to plot against him. But the glamour had a filthy underbelly that is often left out of the history books. With thousands of people and servants living in one building, and almost no plumbing to speak of, the palace was a biological hazard. Chamber pots were frequently dumped out of windows onto the courtyards below. Desperate courtiers, terrified of losing the spot in a procession, would simply relieve themselves in the hallways behind heavy drapes or in the corners of stairwells. The king's solution was simply to douse everything in heavy musk and perfume to mask the decay. The trap wasn't just physical, it was financial. Louis mandated that everyone at court wear the most expensive, elaborate fashions, which changed constantly by his decree. To keep up appearances and stay at court, the nobles had to spend fortunes they often did not have. They borrowed money from the king to buy clothes to impress the king. They were enslaved by their own vanity, too broke to raise an army, too busy fighting over who stood where at dinner to organise a revolution. The peak of this theatre was the Hall of Mirrors. It was a gallery containing 17 massive arches filled with mirrors opposite 17 windows looking out onto the gardens. At night, with thousands of candles lit, the room was blindingly beautiful, turning the night into day. Here the king would hold court, a shining god, in the centre of his own reflection. The nobles would bow and scrape, blinded by the light, ignoring the stench, terrified of being sent away into the social void. They were trapped in a glittering box dancing for their jailer. Louis XIV succeeded in his grand design. He tamed the French nobility completely. They ceased to be warriors and warlords and became domestic servants with fancy titles utterly dependent on his goodwill. He ruled for 72 years, the longest of any monarch of a major sovereign state in European history, effectively becoming the state itself. Versailles stands today as a monument to absolute power and beauty. But if you look closely at the gold leaf and the crystal chandeliers, you have to remember the cost. It was a gilded cage built on a swamp where the price of admission was your dignity, and the air was always heavy with the smell of fear and filth. That is the reality of the Sun King's court, but across the ocean in a small village in America, a different kind of hysteria was about to brew, one that had nothing to do with gold and everything to do with the devil. Leaving the perfumed golden corridors of Versailles behind, we crossed the dark, churning waters of the Atlantic Ocean. We travelled 10 years forward in time, landing on the rocky, frozen coast of Massachusetts. Here in the year 1692, there were no mirrors, no silk, and definitely no mercy. If the court of Louis XIV was a theatre of vanity, the village of Salem was about to become a theatre of paranoia, where the only thing more dangerous than a witch was a neighbour with a grudge. Lie still and imagine lying on your back in a muddy open field. Above you the grey sky is indifferent. On your chest there is a heavy wooden door. Standing on that door are men piling large granite stones one after another. You can feel your ribs bending, the breath being squeezed out of your lungs by hundreds of pounds of crushing weight. This was the reality for an 81-year-old man named Giles Corey, who found himself at the centre of a legal nightmare that started with the whispers of children. Salem Village in winter was a bleak, terrifying place. It was surrounded by thick forests that the Puritans believed were the hiding places of the devil. The people were isolated, constantly worried about attacks from Native Americans, and deeply divided by petty land disputes. In this pressure cooker of boredom and fear, in the kitchen of the local Reverend Samuel Parris, a group of young girls began to experiment with fortune-telling, dropping egg whites into water to see the shapes of their future husbands. But the game went wrong. In January, the girls, including the Reverend's 9-year-old daughter and 11-year-old niece, began to suffer from strange, violent fits. They would scream, throw things, crawl under furniture, and contort their bodies into impossible shapes. A local doctor was called in. Finding no physical cause, he gave a diagnosis that would doom the village. They were under an evil hand. The girls were bewitched. And when pressed to name their tormentors, they pointed fingers at 3 local women. The first 3 accused were easy targets: a slave named Tituba, a homeless beggar, and an impoverished elderly woman. It fit the narrative perfectly, but the hysteria did not stop there. It grew like a cancer feeding on the old grudges of the village. Suddenly upstanding members of the community were being dragged from their homes in chains. Rebecca Nurse, a 71-year-old grandmother known for her piety, was accused. If she could be a witch, then anyone could be a witch. No one was safe. The trials themselves were a spectacle of horror. The courtroom was packed with sweaty, terrified spectators. When an accused person entered the afflicted, girls would fall to the floor screaming that the accused's spirit was pinching them or biting them. They claimed to see birds perched on the rafters that no one else could see. If the accused looked at the girls would collapse. It was a performance that held the entire legal system hostage, turning the courtroom into a circus of fear. This is where the viral seed of this tragedy lies, the acceptance of spectral evidence. The court decided that if a victim said they saw the shape or spirit of the accused hurting them in a dream or a vision, that was admissible proof of guilt. Think about that. There was absolutely no way to defend yourself. You could be asleep in your bed surrounded by witnesses, but if a girl in the courtroom said your ghost was choking her, at that very moment you were guilty. Your alibi meant nothing against a ghost. The madness reached a breaking point with the trial of George Burroughs, a former minister. He stood on the gallows, the noose around his neck, and did something a witch was supposedly unable to do. He recited the Lord's Prayer perfectly, without a single stumble. The crowd gasped some weeping, urging the sheriff to stop. But Cotton Mather, a prominent minister on a horse nearby, told the crowd that the devil could transform into an angel of light. The trapdoor fell. Burroughs swung. But the most brutal chapter belongs to Giles Corey. He was a wealthy farmer with a stubborn streak. He knew that if he pled guilty, he would hang, and his property would be forfeited to the state, leaving his children with nothing. If he pled not guilty and was convicted, the result was the same. So he did the only thing the law didn't know how to handle. He refused to enter a plea at all. He stood mute. To force a plea out of him, the sheriff subjected him to a torture called peine forte et dure, pressing to death. They took him to a field near the prison. They stripped him and laid him on the ground. They placed a board over his body and began to pile on the rocks. The sheriff would ask him to plead, and Corey would stay silent. They added more rocks. The weight became unbearable. His tongue was pressed out of his mouth. The sheriff reportedly used his cane to push it back in. For 2 days, Giles Corey lay there, his body slowly being crushed into the earth. Every time they asked him for a plea, hoping he would scream innocent or guilty, just to stop the pain, the old man would only gasp out 2 words, more weight. He was taunting them with his endurance. He knew that if he died without pleading, he died in the eyes of the law as an innocent man, and his farm would go to his sons-in-law. He accepted an agonising death to secure his family's future. Finally, the weight became too much and his heart burst. By the time the hysteria burned itself out, 20 people had been executed and 5 more had died in prison. It ended only when the accusations reached too high, touching the wife of the governor himself. Suddenly, spectral evidence was no longer good enough. The court was dissolved. The girls grew up. Some married, some moved away. One eventually apologised. But the damage was done. The village had killed its own neighbours because they chose to believe in nightmares over logic. As you listen to the rain, think about how fragile the line is between civilization and savagery. It didn't take an army to destroy Salem. It just took fear and the willingness of good people to stand by while the rules of reality were rewritten. Giles Corey is buried in an unmarked grave, but his last words still echo as a heavy reminder of the weight of silence. Now let's leave the cold ground of New England and travel south to the warm tropical waters of the Caribbean, where another city is about to face a judgment day of its own. While the people of Salem were busy inventing demons to justify killing their neighbours, nature was preparing a very real, very physical apocalypse for a city 2,000 miles to the south. Both tragedies happened in the same year 1692, and both felt like divine judgment. But while Giles Corey was crushed by stones placed by human hands, the people of our next story were crushed by the earth itself, turning into a hungry mouth. At exactly 11:43 in the morning, a pocket watch belonging to a man in Jamaica stopped ticking. That watch would be found centuries later, encased in coral and mud, a frozen testament to the exact minute that the wickedest city on earth ceased to exist. On that bright June morning, the ground did not just shake, it dissolved, and the laws of physics seemed to break down entirely to punish the pirates of Port Royal. Port Royal. Jamaica was the Sodom of the New World. It was a place where pirates, prostitutes, and privateers walked streets paved with stolen gold. Alcohol was cheaper than water, and a man could be stabbed for looking at someone the wrong way. The city was built on a long sandy spit of land jutting out into the ocean, a precarious foundation for so much heavy stone and brick. The locals laughed at warnings from priests believing their wealth made them invincible. The morning of June 7th was eerily calm. The water in the harbour was like glass. The heat was oppressive. Then, without warning, a low rumble began to rise from the deep. It wasn't the wind, it was the sound of the island tearing itself apart. 3 massive shocks hit in rapid succession. In a normal earthquake, buildings fall down. In Port Royal, something much more terrifying happened. The buildings and the people sank. Because the city was built on waterlogged sand, the earthquake triggered a phenomenon known as liquefaction. The intense vibration caused the solid ground to temporarily turn into a liquid slurry. Suddenly, the cobblestone streets people were running on turned into quicksand. Men, women, and children didn't fall over. They dropped straight down into the earth, as if they had stepped onto a trap door. Then came the horror that haunts the history books. As soon as the shaking stopped, the ground instantly solidified again. The liquid sand turned back into hard concrete in the blink of an eye. This left hundreds of people trapped in the ground, buried up to their waists or their necks, unable to move. They were squeezed to death by the earth, their chests crushed just like Giles Corey, or they were left stuck there alive and screaming, their heads protruding from the ground like a grotesque garden. The viral horror of this scene is hard to comprehend. Survivors later reported that as the afternoon wore on, wild dogs from the destroyed city began to roam the streets, attacking and eating the heads of the people who were trapped in the ground and unable to defend themselves. It was a scene from hell, played out under the bright Caribbean sun. Amidst this chaos, a French merchant named Louis Goldie experienced one of the most impossible survival stories ever recorded. When the first shock hit, the ground opened up and swallowed him whole. He was buried deep underground, suffocating in the dark. But moments later, a second massive shockwave hit, and the earth convulsed, literally vomiting him back out. He was launched into the air and landed in the sea alive. He swam to a boat and lived for another 40 years, the man who was rejected by the grave. But the ocean wasn't done. Just as the survivors were trying to pull their neighbours out of the sand, a massive tsunami swept over the sandbar. It smashed the remaining houses and drowned those who were trapped in the ground. The wave also tore open the city's cemetery. In a final twisted irony, the rotting corpses of long-dead pirates were washed out of their graves and floated through the streets, bobbing alongside the freshly dead and the dying. By the time night fell, 2/3 of Port Royal was at the bottom of the ocean. The harbour was clogged with the wreckage of ships and bodies. The wickedest city on earth had been effectively erased. The English government decided not to rebuild on the cursed sandbar, moving across the harbour to found the city of Kingston instead. Today you can still dive in the waters off Jamaica and see the sunken ruins of Port Royal. There are roads, walls and taverns sitting silently on the ocean floor, preserved in the blue twilight. It serves as a quiet underwater monument to human arrogance, a reminder that no matter how much gold you steal or how high you build your walls, you are always just one tremor away from being swallowed by the ground beneath your feet. Leaving the sunken ruins of the Caribbean behind, we now head halfway across the world to the misty mountains of Japan. We are trading the chaos of a pirate city for the silence of a lonely road, walking in the footsteps of a man who sought beauty in the face of death. Leaving the screaming, churning chaos of the Jamaican coast, where death arrived as a sudden violent explosion of nature, we now step into a silence so profound you can almost hear the snow falling. We travel from the noisy destruction of a city to the quiet, slow disintegration of a single soul. On the other side of the world, in the misty mountains of Japan, a man was preparing to take a walk not to save his life, but to find a beautiful place to lose it. Focus your eyes on a single white object lying in the tall green summer grass. It is a human skull, bleached clean by the sun and polished by the wind. It sits by the side of a dirt road, grinning silently at the sky. There is no body attached to it, no weapon nearby, and no sign of a struggle. It is simply a landmark, a grim milestone that travellers pass without screaming. For the man walking down this path, this skull was not a warning. It was a mirror, showing him exactly what he hoped to become. In the year 1689, Matsuo Basho was the most famous poet in Edo, the city we now call Tokyo. He had everything a man of letters could want: devoted students, a comfortable hut, and the respect of the literary world. But inside, Basho was rotting. He felt a deep spiritual sickness, a sense that his comfort was a cage. He looked at his safe life and saw only stagnation. So at the age of 45, which was considered old and frail in those days, he made a decision that baffled his friends. He sold his house. He gave away his possessions. He donned the rough, simple robes of a wandering monk and put on a cypress hat. He told his weeping friends that he was leaving on a journey to the deep north, a wild, lawless frontier of Japan, where the roads faded into deer trails and bandits hid in the forests. He did not pack for a vacation. He packed for a funeral. He wrote that he fully expected to die by the roadside and become a weather-exposed skeleton. The journey he undertook was brutal. Basho was not a healthy man. He suffered from chronic stomach ailments and weak joints. Yet he walked 15, sometimes 20 miles a day through driving rain and blistering heat. He slept in dilapidated farmhouses where the wind blew through the walls. In his diary, He didn't romanticize the suffering. He wrote about the fleas and lice that bit him all night, and the sound of a horse urinating right next to his pillow in a crowded inn. This was the reality of seeking enlightenment. It smelled like dirt and old straw. There is a strange shadowy theory that hangs over this journey, adding a layer of cold intrigue to the poetry. Some historians speculate that Basho was not just a poet, but a spy for the shogun. They point to the fact that he was allowed to pass through strict checkpoints with ease, and that his route took him through the domains of powerful lords who were potential enemies of the state. Was this frail old man actually a government agent, gathering intelligence under the guise of writing haiku? It is a mystery that the mist of history has never fully cleared. The emotional peak of his walk came when he reached Hiraizumi. Centuries before this had been the capital of a powerful warrior clan, a place of golden temples and mighty armies. When Basho arrived, he found nothing but a field of high grass rustling in the wind. The gold was gone, the castles had rotted away, the mighty samurai were dirt under his sandals. He sat there and wept, penning one of his most famous lines, "Summer grass, all that remains of warriors' dreams." He continued north, climbing the holy mountains of Diwa Sanzan. Here the journey turned from physical to spiritual. He walked through forests of cedar trees, so old they seemed to hold up the sky. He underwent rituals of rebirth, wearing white robes usually reserved for corpses. He was shedding his old identity layer by layer, just as he shed the miles. He was no longer the famous teacher from Edo. He was just a tiny breathing speck in a vast, indifferent universe. After 5 months and 1,500 miles, Basho returned to civilization. He had not died, but the man who left Edo was gone. He looked different, weather-beaten, thin, his eyes holding the depth of the northern sky. He spent the next 5 years polishing his travel diary, The Narrow Road to the Deep North. It became a masterpiece, not because it was a travel guide, but because it was a guide to dying, a manual on how to let go of the world while still living in it. Basho died 5 years later, but he got his wish. His poetry taught the world to see the beauty in the impermanent in the moment a frog jumps into a pond, or the silence that follows a cicada's cry. He showed us that life is just a brief journey through the grass, and that in the end we all leave nothing behind but a dream. Now let's leave the quiet contemplation of Japan and march west to the gates of Vienna, where the silence is about to be shattered by the thunder of 18,000 horses. We leave the solitary path of the wandering monk, where the only sound was the wind in the grass, and step directly into a nightmare of noise and claustrophobia. While Basho sought to empty his mind in the mountains of Japan, thousands of miles away, in the heart of Europe, an entire city was praying for a miracle to silence the scratching sounds coming from beneath their floorboards. If you were a citizen of Vienna in the summer of 1683, the most terrifying sound in the world was not a cannon blast or a scream, but a faint rhythmic tap, tap, tap coming from deep underground. It meant that the enemy was literally digging a grave beneath your feet. The Ottoman sappers were tunnelling under the city walls, packing caverns with black powder, preparing to blow the fortifications sky high and bury everyone inside. You couldn't run, you couldn't hide. You just had to sit in your starving city and wait for the ground to explode. This was the Siege of Vienna, the climax of a centuries-old struggle between the Ottoman Empire and the powers of Europe. Leading the invaders was Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha, a man of immense ambition and cruelty. He had brought an army of 150,000 men to the gates of Vienna. His goal was not just to take the city, but to capture the golden apple, the gateway to Western Europe. If Vienna fell, the road to Rome would be open, and the history of the world would be rewritten in Turkish script. Inside the walls, the situation was apocalyptic. The city was packed with refugees, soldiers, and dying citizens. They had been surrounded for 2 months. Food was gone. People were boiling leather and hunting rats just to survive. Dysentery and disease were killing more people than the enemy bullets. The stench of unburied bodies and open sewers was so thick it made the air taste like poison. Every day the defenders looked out from the crumbling walls at the ocean of white tents surrounding them, a sea of enemies that stretched as far as the eye could see. The psychological terror was relentless. The Ottomans would launch severed heads of captured messengers over the walls with catapults to demoralise the defenders. But the real war was happening in the dark, cramped tunnels underground. Viennese counterminers would dig their own tunnels to intercept the Turks. When they broke through into an enemy tunnel, ferocious battles would erupt in pitch blackness, men stabbing each other with knives and pickaxes in a space no wider than a coffin suffocating in the bad air and dust. By September, the city was on its last legs. The walls were breached in several places. The garrison was down to a fraction of its strength. The mayor of Vienna sent out a desperate plea, a final flare in the dark. But Kara Mustafa made a fatal mistake. He was so focused on the prize in front of him, so arrogant in his belief that the city was already his, that he neglected to fortify the dense woods of the Kahlenberg Hill behind his army. He believed no large force could ever move through that steep, rugged terrain. He was wrong. On the night of September 11th, the defenders on the walls looked up at the black slopes of the Kahlenberg and saw something that made them weep with relief. Signal fires were burning. A relief army had arrived. It was a coalition force from across Europe, led by the King of Poland, Jan III Sobieski, a man the Turks called the Lion of Lekistan. He had dragged his heavy cannons and thousands of horses up the treacherous mountain paths in total silence. The next morning the battle began. It was a chaotic, grinding fight that lasted all day. The Ottoman forces were caught between the city walls and the relieving army, but the decisive blow was held back until the late afternoon. King Jan Sobieski stood atop the hill, looking down at the massive Ottoman camp. He saw the enemy lines wavering. He turned to his commanders and gave the order for the charge. What happened next was the single largest cavalry charge in the history of human warfare. 18,000 horsemen began to move down the hill. At the tip of this spear were 3,000 winged hussars, the heavy cavalry of Poland. These men were terrifying to behold. They wore heavy steel armour, and most famously, large wooden frames attached to their backs covered in eagle ostrich or swan feathers. As they gathered speed, these wings were designed to make a clattering, hissing noise that sounded like a rushing storm. Imagine standing in the Ottoman lines and looking up. The ground begins to shake, vibrating so hard it rattles your teeth. Then out of the dust a wall of steel and feathers descends upon you. The winged hussars smashed into the Ottoman flank with the force of a freight train. The sound was deafening, the thunder of 70,000 hooves, the crash of lances shattering shields, and the unearthly hissing of the wings. It was a scene of pure cinematic violence. The Ottoman line didn't just break, it evaporated. The soldiers, terrified by this angel of death descending from the mountain, threw down their weapons and ran. Kara Mustafa tried to rally his troops, but he was swept away in the panic. In less than an hour, the siege that had lasted 2 months was broken. The Polish king entered the abandoned Turkish tent city, which was filled with riches, exotic animals and strange luxuries left behind in the haste. One of the items they found in the abandoned camp were sacks of strange hard brown beans. The soldiers thought it was camel feed and started to burn it, but a spy who had lived in the east smelled the smoke and stopped them. He knew what it was. He took the beans, opened the first coffee house in Vienna, and added milk and honey to make the bitter drink palatable for Europeans. The cappuccino you drink today is a direct descendant of the loot left behind by a fleeing army. Kara Mustafa escaped, but not for long. When he returned to Belgrade in shame, the Sultan sent emissaries to him with a silk cord. He knew what it meant. He kissed the cord and was strangled to death, the price of failure. Vienna was saved, and the tide of the Ottoman Empire began to recede forever. As the rain continues to fall outside your window, imagine the thunder of those hooves fading into the distance. We move from the deafening noise of battle to a silence that is perhaps even more disturbing. We travel from the crowded fields of Austria to the lonely, plague-ridden countryside of England, where a young man is sitting in a dark room, holding a needle and staring into a mirror with a dangerous curiosity. While the cannons were cooling in Vienna and the smoke of battle drifted away, a different kind of fire was burning in the mind of a young man in England. We are moving from a field where thousands fought for land, to a silent room where one man fought for the truth of the universe. But in this war, the weapon was not a lance or a sword. It was a long, blunt needle, and the battlefield was the soft, vulnerable tissue of the human eye. The tip of the metal is cold, but the space between your eye and your skull is terrifyingly warm. You can hear the wet, slick sound of the steel sliding against the fluid of your own body. Most people would pull away in horror at the sensation of a foreign object pushing past the eyelid, scraping against the bone of the socket. But Isaac Newton did not pull away. He pushed deeper, driven by a curiosity that was stronger than his instinct for self-preservation. The year was 1666, a year that many superstitious people believed marked the end of the world. In London, the Great Plague was killing people by the thousands, turning the city into a ghost town of red crosses painted on doors and carts filled with bodies. To escape the Black Death, a 23-year-old student named Isaac fled the university at Cambridge and retreated to his family's isolated farm at Woolsthorpe Manor. It is hard for us to imagine the depth of that isolation today. There was no internet, no telephone, no regular mail service to keep him connected to his peers. Newton was completely alone in a farmhouse surrounded by sheep. For most people, this would be a time of boredom or fear. For Newton, it was a pressure cooker. Without the distractions of professors or social life, his mind began to race, accelerating into places no human thought had ever gone before. He worked in a state of manic intensity. He would forget to eat for days. He would sit motionless in the garden for hours, lost in thought or pace, his room until the floorboards creaked in protest. He was obsessed with the nature of light. At the time, people believed that white light was pure, and that colours were just modifications of it. Newton didn't buy it. He darkened his room, drilled a tiny hole in his window shutter, and played with prisms until he proved that white light held all the colours of the rainbow within it. But studying the light outside wasn't enough for him. He needed to understand the instrument that perceived the light, the human eye. In a time before ethical standards or safety goggles, Newton decided to use himself as the test subject. He wanted to know if he could alter the way he saw colour by physically changing the shape of his eye. This led him to the drawer where he kept his sewing supplies. He took a bodkin, a thick, long needle used for making holes in leather or cloth. He stood before a mirror, or perhaps he just stared into the void of his room. With a steady hand, he slipped the bodkin between his eye and the bone of his eye socket, pushing it back as far as it could go without severing the optic nerve. It is a miracle he didn't blind himself instantly or give himself a fatal infection. Once the needle was lodged deep behind his eyeball, he began to press. He used the metal tool to squeeze and distort the shape of his own eye from the inside. In his journals, he recorded the result with the detached coolness of a scientist. He wrote that when he pressed the eye with the end of the bodkin, he saw several white, dark and coloured circles. He was literally hacking his own biology to see things that weren't there. He repeated this experiment multiple times. He stared at the sun until he nearly burned out his retinas, forcing himself to stay in a dark room for days, afterward to recover. He was pushing his body to the absolute limit, treating his eyes not as precious organs, but as lenses to be ground polished and tested. He was a man possessed, willing to risk eternal darkness, just to understand how light worked. This period of isolation, known as his annus mirabilis, or Year of Wonders, produced the foundation for almost all of modern physics. He developed calculus, the laws of motion, and the theory of gravity. The story of the apple falling on his head is the one we tell children because it is safe and pleasant. But the story of the needle in the eye is the true measure of his genius. It shows a mind so hungry for truth that pain and safety became irrelevant. When the plague finally subsided and he returned to Cambridge, he carried with him notebooks filled with secrets that would change the world. He was a different man, harder and stranger. He had seen the mechanics of the universe, but he had also felt the cold steel of a needle against the back of his own skull. He walked the line between enlightenment and self-destruction, and unlike many others, he managed to walk back. There is a thin line between a vision and a hallucination, between a genius and a madman. Isaac Newton danced on that line alone in a farmhouse while the world died around him. He gave us the science to understand the stars, but he paid for it with the terrified silence of a room where a young man sat with a needle in his hand, wondering what would happen if he pushed just a little bit harder. Now let's leave the cold, solitary intellectualism of England and travel to the opulent, dangerous courts of China. We are moving from a young man who used a needle to find truth to a young boy who used a game to seize power. Leaving the quiet desperation of Newton's laboratory, where a single needle sought the truth in the dark, we travel thousands of miles east to the heart of Beijing, China. We enter a place where silence was a luxury, and every wall had ears. We move from a young man alone in a farmhouse to a young boy surrounded by thousands of servants, yet who was perhaps even more alone. In the Forbidden City, the stakes were not scientific discovery, but survival, and the experiment was about to see if a group of laughing children could take down a monster. If you stood in the courtyard of the Imperial Palace in the year 1669, you would hear a sound that seemed completely out of place in such a serious environment. It was the sound of teenage boys laughing, shouting, and slapping each other's backs. To any observer, it looked like a recess break at a school. A group of young Manchus were wrestling, tumbling in the dust, playing a rough game known as buku. But this was not a game. It was a rehearsal for an execution hidden in plain sight. The boy watching them with a smile on his face was the Kangxi Emperor. He was only 15 years old. To the outside world, he was the son of heaven, the ruler of the vast Qing dynasty. In reality, he was a prisoner in his own home. The real power belonged to a man named Boy, a decorated general and regent who had turned the court into his personal slaughterhouse. Boy was not a politician. He was a warrior, a man who had earned his position by stacking bodies on the battlefield. Boy was terrifying. He was physically imposing, a veteran of countless wars who wore his scars like medals. He treated the young emperor with open contempt. He killed ministers who disagreed with him, confiscated land from the people, and walked through the palace with a swagger that said he was the true master of China. He looked at Kangxi and saw a soft, bookish child, a puppet that he could manipulate until the boy was old enough to be discarded or killed. Kangxi knew he was living on borrowed time. He wanted to remove Boy, but he had a problem. Boy controlled the army. He controlled the palace guards. If Kangxi ordered his arrest, the guards would likely arrest the emperor instead. The boy needed a weapon that Boy wouldn't recognise as a threat. So he looked at the only people Boy ignored: the children. Kangxi selected a group of young strong boys from the families of his loyal attendants. He told the court he wanted to learn the traditional Manchu art of wrestling to honour his ancestors. Boy thought this was hilarious. He saw it as the emperor indulging in childish hobbies, playing roughhouse with his friends instead of learning how to rule. Every time Boy walked past the courtyard and saw the boys grappling and falling over each other, he would laugh. He didn't see a special forces unit. He saw a playground. For months, the game continued. The boys weren't just wrestling. They were learning how to coordinate a swarm attack. They were learning how to lock joints, how to use their combined weight to pin down a man twice their size, and how to strike without hesitation. They trained every single day under the guise of play sweating in the sun, while the target of their training walked right past them, completely unaware that the wolves were growing teeth. The day of the trap arrived in the summer. Kangxi summoned Boy to the palace for a private audience. It was a routine meeting. Boy arrived with his usual arrogance, leaving his personal bodyguards outside the hall because he feared nothing from a 15-year-old boy. He strode into the room, perhaps expecting a lecture or a request for more money. What he found was the emperor sitting calmly on his throne and the wrestling team standing quietly along the walls. As Boy stepped forward to bow, or perhaps just to nod, given his disrespect, Kangxi dropped the mask. He gave a sharp signal. In a split second, the atmosphere in the room changed from a royal audience to a street brawl. The boys didn't hesitate. They didn't attack one by one like in a movie. They launched themselves at the giant general, all at once, a coordinated wave of limbs and muscle. Boy was a warrior. a man who had killed trained soldiers, but he was taken completely by surprise. He tried to fight back, throwing the teenagers off him with his massive strength. But for every boy he threw off, two more latched onto his arms and legs. They were like ants taking down a beetle. They used the specific locks they had practiced thousands of times. They swept his legs, they bent his arms behind his back. The sound of his roaring fury was drowned out by the grunts of exertion from the boys he had mocked. Within moments, the most feared man in China was pinned face down on the palace floor, helpless. He looked up breathless and shocked to see the 15-year-old emperor standing over him. The child was looking down with cold, steely eyes. The game was over. Kangxi ordered Oh Boy to be thrown into prison. He listed 30 crimes against the regent, including treason and tyranny. Oh Boy died in prison shortly after some say of rage, some say of a sudden illness gifted by the emperor. With the tiger in the cage, Kangxi took full control of the government. He would go on to reign for 61 years, becoming one of the greatest and most capable emperors in Chinese history, a man who expanded the empire and patronised the arts and sciences. But it all started in that courtyard with the sound of laughter and the thud of bodies hitting the ground. It is a reminder that the most dangerous weapon is the one you don't take seriously. Oh Boy lost everything because he looked at a group of young people and saw only children playing a game, forgetting that even a kitten will eventually grow into a tiger if you give it enough time. Now let's leave the triumphant rise of a young emperor and travel back to Europe, to a damp, dark cell where a man is suffering a fate far worse than death. He is a man with no face, no name, and a secret that terrified the most powerful king on earth. Leaving the bright sunlit courtyard of the Forbidden City, where a teenage emperor proved his identity to the world, we descend into the damp, suffocating darkness of a French dungeon. While Kangxi fought to claim his name and his power, the man in our next story was fighting a losing battle just to keep his own face. We travel back to the realm of Louis XIV to witness a punishment so cruel that it turned a living human being into a ghost. In July of 1669, the French Minister of War sat at his desk and dipped a quill into black ink. He was writing a letter to a prison governor named Saint-Mars, and the orders he wrote were chilling in their specificity. He was sending a new prisoner, a man whose arrival was to be kept a state secret. The order read, "You will prepare a cell with multiple doors closing one after the other so that his words cannot be heard outside. You will bring him food yourself once a day. If he speaks of anything other than his basic needs, you will kill him without hesitation." This was the beginning of the most famous mystery in French history. The prisoner arrived in Pignerol in late August. He was not dragged in screaming. He walked in silence, surrounded by musketeers, and on his face he wore a mask. History and Hollywood often depict this as a heavy, rusted iron helmet bolted onto his skull. The reality was likely even more sinister, because it was designed for long-term concealment, not immediate torture. It was a mask made of black velvet reinforced with whalebone or metal strips secured with a padlock at the back of the neck. It covered his entire face, leaving only slits for his eyes and mouth. He wore this mask not for a day or a week, but for 34 years. He slept in it, he ate in it, and he likely wept in it. The fabric would have become hot, itchy, and foul-smelling, a constant physical reminder that he had been erased. He was a man without a face, known only as the prisoner. Saint-Mars, the jailer, became a prisoner of his own success. His entire career became defined by guarding this one man. Wherever Saint-Mars was transferred from Pignerol to the island of Sainte-Marguerite, and finally to the Bastille, the prisoner went with him. They travelled in a specially constructed sedan chair, sealed tight with wax to prevent anyone from seeing inside. When they stopped for the night, the prisoner ate alone with 2 pistols lying on the table beside his plate, pointed at his chest, just in case he tried to talk to the server. The question that drove Europe mad was simple. Who was he? Why keep him alive? If he was a traitor, why not execute him? If he was a nobody, why the elaborate security? The rumours were wild. Some whispered he was a disgraced general. Others said he was the illegitimate son of the king. But the most persistent and dangerous rumour, the one that has survived to this day, is that he was the twin brother of Louis XIV. a brother whose very existence threatened the king's claim to the throne and thus had to be hidden, but could not be killed because he had royal blood. There is a story, perhaps a legend, that illustrates the paranoia surrounding him. It is said that while imprisoned in a tower overlooking the sea, the prisoner used a silver fork to scratch his name onto a silver dinner plate. He threw the plate out of the window, hoping it would wash ashore and someone would read it. An illiterate fisherman found the plate and brought it to the jailer thinking he would be rewarded. St. Mars looked at the plate, then looked at the fisherman and asked, "Have you read what is written here?" The fisherman said no, he could not read. St. Mars killed him anyway, just to be sure. The end came in 1703 inside the walls of the Bastille. The prisoner, now an old man, died of a sudden illness. He had spent over 3 decades in a velvet tomb, but his death was not the end of the erasure. The clean-up operation that followed was frantic and total. St. Mars ordered the cell to be scrubbed down to the stone. The furniture was taken out and burned. The walls were scraped and whitewashed to ensure no message had been scratched into the plaster. The floor tiles were pried up and replaced in case a note was hidden underneath. Even the glass in the window was melted down. They wanted to ensure that this man left absolutely no trace that he had ever walked the earth. He was buried in the parish cemetery of St. Paul under the name Marchioli, a false name for a false life. His clothes, his few possessions, and that cursed mask were likely destroyed. The man in the iron mask remains a shadow, a terrifying example of how the state can swallow a person whole. As you picture the smoke rising from the burning furniture in the courtyard of the Bastille, let's move from a man who was hidden from the world to a man who wanted to see everything in it, even if he had to rip it out with his own hands. We travel north to the cold, wet docks of the Netherlands, where a giant is walking the streets in disguise. Leaving the silent, erased existence of the prisoner in the Bastille, where a man was forced to hide his identity to save his life, we travel north to the bustling shipyards of the Netherlands and England. Here we find another ruler who tried to hide his identity, but for a very different reason. While the prisoner in the iron mask was invisible because he was a secret, the man in our next story was impossible to hide because he was a literal giant who treated the world like his personal laboratory. Imagine sitting in a wooden chair, your head pressed back against the hard rest. Towering over you is a man who stands nearly 7 feet tall, a height that in the 17th century made him look like a mythological monster. He is holding a pair of rusty iron pliers that look like they belong in a blacksmith's forge, not a medical clinic. He is smiling, shaking with excitement. You are not a patient. You are a courtier who made the mistake of mentioning a toothache, and the Tsar of Russia has decided to practice his new hobby on you. This was Peter the Great, the absolute ruler of Russia. In 1697, he realised his country was falling behind the rest of Europe. It was medieval superstitious and lacked a navy. So Peter did something unprecedented. He left the throne and went on a road trip. He organised the Grand Embassy, a massive diplomatic mission to the West. But Peter didn't want to go as a Tsar, he wanted to go as a student. He adopted the fake name Peter Mikhailov and dressed in the clothes of a common shipwright. The disguise was comically ineffective. Peter was 6 feet 8 inches tall in an era when the average man was 5'5". He had a distinct facial tic, a booming voice and an entourage of hundreds following him. When he walked into a Dutch shipyard and asked for a job swinging a hammer, everyone knew exactly who he was. But they played along terrified of the giant man who wanted to learn how to build ships with his own bare hands. He worked hard, sweating in the sun, sleeping in small quarters, and drinking heavily in local taverns. But shipbuilding wasn't his only interest. Peter developed a morbid fascination with the human body, specifically surgery and anatomy. In Amsterdam, he attended an autopsy lesson by a famous doctor. When he noticed that his Russian nobles were disgusted by the sight of the dissected corpse turning green and covering their noses, Peter snapped. He forced them to walk up to the cadaver and bite into its exposed muscles, terrifying them into submission to teach them scientific curiosity. However, his true passion was dentistry. He bought a case of dental instruments and carried them everywhere. He considered himself an expert surgeon, though he had zero formal training. If a servant, a guard, or a passerby looked like they were in pain, Peter would pin them down and yank out the offending tooth. He didn't use anesthesia. He used brute force. He kept the pulled teeth in a velvet bag, as trophies, proudly displaying them as evidence of his medical skill, while his victims nursed shattered jaws and infections. The climax of this cultural collision happened when Peter returned to Russia in 1698. He was determined to drag his country into the modern age, whether they liked it or not. The symbol of old Russia was the long flowing beard worn by the boyars, nobles, and Orthodox priests. To Peter, these beards represented backwardness. At his homecoming banquet, the most powerful men in Russia lined up to bow to him, grateful for his return. Peter didn't embrace them. He pulled out a pair of long, sharp shears. Right there in the reception hall, the Tsar grabbed the beard of the commander of the army and chopped it off. The room went silent. To these men, the beard was a religious symbol, a sign of God's image. Peter moved down the line laughing, shearing the faces of his weeping nobles one by one. It was a violent, humiliating assault on their identity. He later instituted a beard tax. If you wanted to keep your facial hair, you had to pay the state and wear a copper coin around your neck that said, "The beard is a useless burden." Peter the Great built the Russian Empire and the magnificent city of St. Petersburg, which rose from the swamps on the bones of thousands of conscripted labourers. He modernised the army, the alphabet, and the calendar. But the price of this progress was paid in the blood and dignity of his people. He was a visionary, but he was also a mad scientist who viewed his subjects not as humans, but as raw material to be hammered, cut, and shaved into a new shape. As we picture the bag of human teeth rattling at the Tsar's belt, we leave the frozen north and head back to the steaming jungles of Central America. We are trading the cold steel of dental pliers for the gnawing, empty pain of starvation. We are about to join a march where men became monsters just to survive. Leaving the cold marble halls of Russia, where a Tsar collected teeth as trophies, we travel to the humid, rotting jungles of the Caribbean. Here men would have gladly given their own teeth for a single piece of bread. We are moving from a leader who inflicted pain for science to a leader who led his men into a green hell for greed, forcing them to commit an act of survival so desperate it turns a stomach just to think about it. Imagine sitting around a dying campfire in the middle of a swamp holding a piece of tough, dry leather that used to be a bag for carrying gunpowder. You take a rock and smash the leather between two stones to soften it. You scrape off the hair and the dirt. Then you slice it into strips, boil it in dirty water, and force it down your throat, trying not to vomit as the chemically treated hide sticks in your gullet. This was the dinner menu for the most feared army in the New World. The year was 1671. Henry Morgan, the most famous privateer of the age, had a bold plan. He wanted to sack Panama City, the jewel of the Spanish Empire, the place where all the Peruvian silver was stored, before being shipped to Europe. To get there, he gathered an army of 1,400 pirates. He promised them women, wine, and enough gold to live like kings, but he forgot to mention the jungle. To reach Panama, the pirates had to cross the isthmus on foot, marching through dense rainforests and swamps. Morgan expected to find food in the Spanish villages along the way, but the Spanish governor knew they were coming. He issued a scorched earth order. Every village was burned, every cow was killed, and removed every grain of corn was destroyed. The pirates walked into a green desert. By the fourth day, the hunger was turning men into animals. They were hacking through vines and wading through waist-deep mud, their stomachs cramping with emptiness. They began to eat the grass on the side of the trail. They ate leaves that made their mouths blister. They looked at each other not as comrades but as potential meat. The discipline of the fleet began to dissolve into the primal madness of starvation. It was on the sixth day that they found a barn with some old leather bags scattered on the floor. In a normal world, this was trash. In the eyes of starving men, it was a feast. They fought over the leather. History records the recipe they used: beat the leather with stones, soak it, grill it over a fire to burn off the varnish, and swallow it whole with huge gulps of water. It provided no nutrition, only the sensation of something filling the void in their bellies. Then a cruel miracle happened. As they neared the city, the Spanish played their trump card. They released a stampede of 2,000 wild bulls toward the pirate lines, hoping to trample the invaders to death. But the Spanish underestimated the power of hunger. The pirates didn't run. They cheered. They shot the bulls, and within minutes the animals were being carved up and eaten, raw blood dripping down the beards of men who hadn't seen meat in over a week. Fueled by the blood of the bulls, Morgan's army attacked Panama City. The battle was brutal, but the pirates fought with the fury of men who knew that defeat meant starving to death. The Spanish lines collapsed. The pirates breached the city gates, ready to claim their prize. But just as they entered, fires began to break out. Whether it was the retreating governor or the drunken pirates who started it, the result was the same. Panama City, built of cedar wood and filled with silk and spices, burned to the ground. The pirates spent weeks sifting through the hot ash, melting down silverware, and torturing hidden citizens to find out where the gold was buried. They found some, but the vast treasure galleon, the Trinity, had sailed away just hours before they arrived, taking the bulk of the fortune with it. The final twist of the knife came when it was time to go home. Henry Morgan had the loot tallied up. He realised there wasn't enough to make everyone rich. So while his men were asleep or drunk, Morgan loaded the lion's share of the treasure onto his own ship and quietly sailed away, leaving the bulk of his army stranded on the beach, without food or ships. It was the ultimate betrayal. Henry Morgan didn't get hanged for his crimes. He returned to England, was knighted by King Charles II, and was sent back to Jamaica as the lieutenant governor. He spent the rest of his life hanging pirates, the same kind of men he had led through the jungle. He died a fat, wealthy man, while the men who ate leather to make him rich rotted in unnamed graves. It is a grim reminder that in the eyes of history, the difference between a criminal and a hero often comes down to who holds the gold at the end of the story. Now let's wash the taste of old leather out of our mouths and travel back to the sophisticated parlours of Paris, where the menu included something far more sinister than animal hide. Leaving the desperate hunger of the Panamanian jungle, where men became animals just to survive, we travel back to the heart of civilization, Paris, France. Here the hunger was different. It wasn't for food, but for power and eternal youth. And to satisfy it, the wealthiest women in the world were visiting a quiet garden in the suburbs, where a furnace was burning something that looked like firewood, but was actually the tiny, fragile bones of infants. Paris in the late 1670s was the most sophisticated city on earth, but underneath the perfume and the lace, it was awash in poison. In the salons of the aristocracy, arsenic had acquired a polite, dark nickname, inheritance powder. It was the ultimate solution for a young, ambitious wife with an old, wealthy husband who just wouldn't die fast enough. But the police chief of Paris, a man named Gabriel Nicolas de la Reynie, began to pull at a loose thread that would eventually unravel the entire French court. The thread led him to a woman named Catherine Monvoisin, known to the underworld simply as La Voisin. On the surface, she was a midwife and a fortune teller who catered to the superstitious elite. But if you paid enough gold, she offered more than just palm readings. She offered remedies to remove problems. She was the spider in the centre of a web that reached from the gutters of Paris all the way to the golden bed of the king himself. As Lorraine interrogated her associates, the investigation revealed something far darker than simple murder for money. To keep the king's love and maintain their status, high-ranking noblewomen, allegedly including the king's own mistress, Madame de Montespan, sought La Voisine's help. The solution they bought was the Black Mass. A renegade priest named Father Guibourg would perform a mockery of the Catholic Mass in a basement illuminated by black candles. But instead of a stone altar, he used the naked body of a noblewoman. And instead of wine, he used blood. This is where the story turns into a nightmare that shook the nation. The blood for these rituals had to be fresh and innocent. La Voisin and her network would purchase unwanted infants from beggars, prostitutes, and the desperate poor for a few coins. During the ritual, the child would be held over the living altar, its throat slit, and the blood collected in a chalice to be used in love potions or anointed on the participants. It was industrial-scale child sacrifice happening in the shadow of the cathedral. Police Chief Lorraine was a man of law, and he was horrified by what he found. He gathered piles of evidence, grim confessions, and a list of names that read like a who's who of Versailles. He was ready to prosecute the highest levels of the court. But when he presented the evidence to King Louis XIV, the king turned pale. The names on the list included the mother of his own children. To save the dignity of the crown and prevent the monarchy from collapsing under the weight of the scandal, Louis made a choice. He ordered the specific files relating to his mistress and her circle to be burned. He essentially obstructed justice to protect his image. Madame de Montespan was quietly retired to a convent, living out her days, in comfort her crimes washed away by royal decree. But for the lower-level players like La Voisin, there would be no mercy. On February 22, 1680, La Voisin was dragged to the Place de Grève for execution. She had spent the day drinking heavily to numb the fear. She fought the executioners with the strength of a wild animal, kicking and screaming obscenities as they tied her to the iron stake. As the hay was lit beneath her, she tried to push the burning straw away with her feet, fighting the fire until the flames finally engulfed her. By the time the affair of the poisons was officially closed, 36 people had been executed, and dozens more were imprisoned or sent to the galleys. The king had successfully buried the worst of the secrets, but the truth lingered in the smoke. The Sun King had built his reign on glory, but the foundation was stained with the blood of the innocent and the ashes of a cover-up. It serves as a grim reminder that underneath the powdered wigs, the silk dresses, and the polite manners of high society, there often lurks a savagery that makes the jungle seem civilized. They were willing to burn the future in a furnace just to keep a seat at the dinner table. Now let's leave the corrupted palaces of France and cross the ocean to the high desert of New Mexico. We are trading secret poisons for a secret code, one made not of chemicals, but of simple knots in a rope, which would trigger an apocalypse for the invaders. Leaving the smoke-filled chambers of Versailles, where secrets were burned to protect a corrupt monarchy, we travel to the dry, dusty canyons of the American Southwest. Here in the year 1680, secrets were not being destroyed, they were being distributed, and the medium of communication wasn't paper or whispers, but a simple piece of yucca fibre rope, with a series of knots tied into it. It was the most dangerous clock in history, ticking down to an explosion of blood and fire. Imagine standing on a high mesa in New Mexico, looking out over the vast, empty desert. In the distance you see two figures running. They are not warriors carrying spears, but messengers carrying a secret code. They are running from village to village, covering hundreds of miles of rough terrain. In their hands they hold the destiny of an entire civilization. The rope is not a weapon, but a calendar. Every knot represents a day, and when the last knot is untied, the world of the white man will end. The Pueblo people had been living under the iron boot of the Spanish Empire for 80 years. The Spanish soldiers and Franciscan friars had come with a cross in one hand and a sword in the other. They forced the indigenous people to build churches on top of their sacred kivas. They banned the traditional dances and burned the kachina dolls, the wooden effigies of the spirit guides. Those who resisted were enslaved, whipped, or had one foot cut off as a permanent reminder of who was in charge. But in the shadows of the sacred mountains, a medicine man named Pope was plotting a masterstroke. He had been imprisoned and flogged by the Spanish for sorcery, and he emerged from that cell with a cold, hard resolve. He knew he couldn't beat the Spanish in a straight fight. They had guns and armour. He needed something the Spanish didn't understand: absolute unity and perfect timing. He needed every single Pueblo village speaking different dialects and separated by miles of desert to strike at the exact same moment. The plan relied on the knotted cords. Pope sent runners to every village chief with a deerskin strip containing a number of knots. The instruction was simple: untie one knot each morning. When the rope is smooth, we rise. It was a binary code of rebellion, an analog encryption that the Spanish soldiers with all their military training couldn't decipher, even if they intercepted a runner. They just saw a piece of string. However, just days before the attack, the plan was betrayed. 2 messengers were captured, and under torture they revealed the meaning of the knots. The Spanish governor in Santa Fe panic-strickenly prepared for a siege. But Pope made a brilliant split-second decision. Instead of calling it off, he accelerated the timeline. He sent out the order, "The time is now." The knots were cast aside. On August 10th, the silence of the desert was shattered. From the Taos Pueblo in the north to the Hopi mesas in the west, the indigenous people rose up as one. The violence was focused and symbolic. They didn't just kill the priests, they dismantled the religion that had been forced upon them. Mission bells were melted down. Crosses were smashed. In one terrifying instance, a priest was dragged to the top of the church tower and thrown off his body, landing on the very steps where he used to preach obedience. The survivors fled to Santa Fe, the capital. The governor found himself trapped in the palace, surrounded by an army of thousands who were no longer asking for mercy. The Pueblo warriors cut the city's water supply, a tactic learned from the harsh desert itself. After days of thirst and desperation, the governor and the remaining settlers made a break for it, retreating south toward what is now El Paso. As they looked back, they saw the sky turned black by the smoke of their burning churches. With the invaders gone, the Pueblo people performed a ritual that is as haunting as it is powerful. They went down to the rivers and scrubbed their bodies with the roots of the yucca plant. They were not just washing off the dirt of war, they were literally scrubbing off their baptisms. They washed away the Christian names they had been given and reclaimed their own. They divorced themselves from the god of their conquerors and invited the Cachinas back into the Kivas. The Pueblo Revolt of 1680 remains the most successful indigenous uprising in North American history. For 12 years they lived free in their own land. It serves as a reminder that you can conquer a people's land, burn their idols, and outlaw their dances, but you cannot untie the knot of their spirit. Now let's leave the triumphant dust of New Mexico and return to the damp shadows of London, where a man who has lost his sight is about to see something far more terrifying than any war. Leaving the sun-drenched rivers of New Mexico, where an entire nation scrubbed the Christian faith from their bodies to be free, we travel back to the smoky, rain-slicked ruins of London. Here we find a man who is doing the exact opposite. He is diving so deep into that faith that he is rewriting the geography of hell itself, but he is doing it without ever seeing the ink on the page. We are moving from a rebellion fought with knots and stones to a rebellion fought with words inside a pitch-black room. Focus your attention on the eyes of the man sitting in the wooden chair. They are wide open, pale, and unblinking, staring intently at a wall he cannot see. This is John Milton in the year 1667. He is 58 years old, completely blind and living in poverty. He is a political outcast, a man who supported the overthrow of the king, and now that the monarchy has returned, he is lucky to be alive. He sits in total darkness, but inside his head, a war is raging that is brighter and more violent than anything happening on Earth. Milton described his condition not as a disability, but as a terrifying form of possession. He claimed that every night when he lay in his bed, a celestial patroness or muse would visit him. This force would whisper thousands of lines of complex rhythmic poetry into his ear while he slept. He described the sensation as being a cow that needed to be milked. If he didn't get the words out of his head immediately upon waking, he felt physically ill, as if his brain would burst from the pressure of the unwritten verses. The process of writing Paradise Lost was a scene of domestic misery. Milton would wake up early, his mind overflowing with images of burning lakes and fallen angels. He would scream for his daughters to come to him. These young women, who often resented their father and his demanding nature, would have to sit for hours scribbling furiously as the blind man recited the epic poem from memory. He dictated the punctuation, the spelling and the rhythm, never seeing a single word of the masterpiece he was creating. The story he told was the oldest one in the book, The Fall of Man. But Milton did something dangerous. When he described Satan, he didn't paint him as a mindless monster with horns. He painted him as a charismatic, complex revolutionary, a figure who stood up to an all-powerful authority and declared better to reign in hell than serve in heaven. It was a reflection of Milton's own rebellious spirit, a man who had fought against a king and lost, now channeling his rage into the mouth of the devil. For years this went on. The blind man sat in his chair, rocking back and forth, seeing visions of a war in heaven that were so vivid they seemed more real to him than the London fog outside. He constructed an entire universe of pandemonium, the capital of hell, with its diamond columns and golden roofs, all while sitting in a draughty house that smelled of old smoke. He was building a palace in his mind to escape the prison of his body. When the work was finally done, it consisted of over 10,000 lines of blank verse. It is considered one of the greatest works in the English language, a poem that changed the way the world visualised the Bible. And what was the reward for this blind genius? He sold the publishing rights for exactly £5. It was a pittance, barely enough to buy wood for the winter, for a work that would last forever. John Milton died quiet and poor, his eyes never seeing the light of day again. But he proved that the most vivid sights are not the ones we see with our retinas, but the ones we construct in the dark. He turned his blindness into a lens that magnified the human condition, showing us that even in the deepest pit of hell, there is a kind of terrible, beautiful majesty. Now let's leave the intellectual fires of Milton's imagination and travel to the island of Sicily, where the fire is real liquid and flowing straight toward the city walls. We are about to witness a battle where men try to fight a volcano with nothing but wet cowhides and pickaxes. Leaving the blind poet in London, who spent his nights dreaming of a lake of fire in the underworld, we travel south to an island where that lake of fire punched a hole through the crust of the earth and spilled out into reality. We are moving from the heat of the imagination to the searing physical heat of Sicily, where a group of men is about to engage in a fistfight right next to a river of molten rock. The air is so hot that it instantly scorches the hairs inside your nose. You are standing inches away from a moving wall of lava that is 20 feet high. You are not wearing a fire suit or holding a hose. You are wrapped in the raw, bloody skin of a freshly killed cow soaked in water, and you are swinging a heavy iron pickaxe into the side of the volcano's flow. The steam rising from your own clothes is blinding, but you keep swinging because if you stop, your city dies. This was the scene on the slopes of Mount Etna in the spring of 1669. Etna is one of the most active volcanoes in the world, a constant grumbling threat to the people of Sicily. But this eruption was different. It wasn't just a plume of ash, it was a hemorrhage. A massive fissure had opened up, and a river of lava miles long was rolling slowly but inexorably toward the great city of Catania. It had already swallowed 14 villages, erasing them from the map as if they never existed. In the face of this apocalypse, the people of Catania tried everything. They held processions carrying the relics of Saint Agatha toward the lava, praying for a miracle. The lava kept coming. They built walls of stone and earth. The lava crushed them. It seemed that the city was doomed to be buried, just like Pompeii. But a man named Diego Pappalardo refused to accept the will of nature. He proposed a plan that was so dangerous it sounded suicidal they would attack the lava. Pappalardo gathered a team of 50 men. They dressed in their makeshift armour of wet cowhides to protect against the radiant heat which was strong enough to ignite cloth from a distance. They carried iron bars, mattocks and pickaxes. Their goal was to hike up the side of the volcano, find the lava channel, and break open the solidifying crust on one side. The theory was that if they broke the bank of the lava river, the fluid rock would spill out sideways and miss the city. It was grueling, terrifying work. The men were essentially performing surgery on a monster. They hacked away at the black crusty shell of the flow, while the red magma pulsed beneath them. The heat was unbearable. Many of them suffered burns, and the cowhide steamed and dried out in minutes. But amazingly, it began to work. They managed to breach the wall. A stream of lava hissed out, diverting the main pressure away from Catania. The city cheered. They had beaten the volcano. But in solving one problem, they created another. As the lava flowed out of the new breach, it began to snake its way down a different valley. And sitting directly in that path was the town of Paterno. The people of Paterno looked up and saw that their neighbours in Catania had saved themselves by pointing a loaded gun at them. They didn't see heroes, they saw murderers. What followed is one of the most absurd battles in history. 500 armed men from Paterno marched up the mountain. They weren't there to fight the volcano, they were there to fight the Catanians. They fired muskets and arrows at Pappalardo's men, forcing them to stop their work and retreat. It was a civil war fought on the edge of an eruption. The men of Paterno plugged the breach back up to save their homes, sealing the fate of Catania once again. With the breach closed, the lava returned to its original course. It rolled relentlessly toward the city walls of Catania. It piled up against the medieval fortifications, rising higher and higher until it simply spilled over the top like boiling milk in a pot. It crushed the palaces, the churches, and the houses. It surrounded the massive Ursino castle, which used to be on the coast, and pushed the coastline out by a mile, burying the harbour. Catania was largely destroyed, not because the engineering failed, but because human politics got in the way. The incident was so chaotic that the Spanish government, which ruled Sicily at the time, passed a law declaring that no one was ever allowed to interfere with lava flows again. It was a legal admission that while you might be able to divert nature, you cannot divert the selfishness of desperate men. As the smoke clears over the ruins of the castle, we leave the heat of the volcano and travel north to the frozen lands of Scandinavia. We are trading a queen of fire for a queen of ice, a woman who shocked the world not by fighting a mountain, but by walking away from a throne. Leaving the heat of the volcano and the desperation of men fighting nature, we travel north to the frozen halls of Sweden. Here the struggle wasn't against lava or ash, but against the rigid, suffocating expectations of gender and power. We are trading a queen of fire for a queen of ice. A woman who shocked the world not by conquering a new land, but by throwing her own crown into the trash. Power is usually a drug that no one wants to quit. In the history of monarchy, kings and queens have murdered their own siblings and children just to keep the crown on their heads for one more day. But in 1654, the most powerful woman in Northern Europe did the unthinkable. She didn't just step down, she staged her resignation, like a piece of high theatre, stripping herself of an empire to put on a pair of men's breeches. Christina of Sweden was never given a chance to be a normal girl. Her father was Gustavus Adolphus, the Lion of the North, a terrifying warrior king who saved Protestant Europe. When he died in battle, Christina became queen-elect at the age of 6. The court decided to raise her not as a princess, but as a prince. She was taught to ride, to shoot, to hunt bears, and to curse like a soldier. She was an intellectual giant trapped in a role she despised. As she grew older, the pressure to conform became suffocating. The Swedish court needed her to do one thing: marry a German prince and produce an heir to secure the dynasty. Christina found the idea repulsive. She famously said she would rather die than be married. She despised the company of women, hating the sewing circles and the gossip. She surrounded herself with philosophers, including René Descartes, waking him up at 5 a.m. to discuss the nature of the soul in the freezing castle, until the poor man caught pneumonia and died. But Christina had a secret that was far more dangerous than her refusal to marry. In the heart of Lutheran Sweden, where being a Catholic was considered treason punishable by death or exile, the Queen had secretly converted. She had been seduced not by a man, but by the intellectual complexity of the Catholic faith and the art of Rome. She was living a double life, sitting on a Protestant throne while whispering prayers to a forbidden pope. The tension broke in June of 1654. In a grand ceremony at Uppsala Castle, Christina shocked the world. She stood before the weeping Senate and removed her crown. One by one, the symbols of power were taken from her: the apple, the sceptre, the keys, the mantle. Witnesses said she didn't shed a tear. She stood tall, her face beaming with a strange relief. She was stripping off a costume she had hated wearing for 28 years. The moment she left the country, the transformation was total. She cut her hair short. She traded her heavy velvet dresses for a man's jacket and sword. She rode a horse astride not side saddle. When she crossed a stream that marked the border of her kingdom, she reportedly shouted, "Free at last!" She was no longer a queen. She was Count Dohna, a travelling nobleman. She headed straight for the one place that represented everything Sweden was not Rome. The Vatican welcomed her with open arms. The conversion of the daughter of the great Protestant hero was a massive propaganda victory for the Pope. They treated her like a trophy, but the Pope soon realised that Christina was not a humble, pious nun. She was a firebrand. She talked loudly during Mass, she criticised the cardinals, and she scandalised Roman society by wearing men's clothes and swearing openly. She was a guest from hell. But the darkest chapter of her post-royal life happened in France. Christina was staying at the Palace of Fontainebleau as a guest of the French king. She discovered that her master of horse, a man named Gian Rinaldo Monaldeschi, had been betraying her secrets to her enemies. Even though she had abdicated, Christina still believed she carried the divine right of kings within her blood. She believed she was a sovereign state of one person with the absolute right to execute traitors. On November 10th, 1657, she summoned Monaldeschi to a gallery in the palace. She showed him the letters proving his guilt. He fell to his knees, weeping and begging for mercy. The scene was grotesque. Monaldeschi was wearing a coat of chainmail under his shirt because he suspected she might kill him. Christina was unmoved. She turned to her guards and gave a simple order: execute him. It was a messy amateur butchery. The guards struck at Monaldeschi, but the chainmail protected his torso. They had to hack at his neck and face. He ran around the room bleeding and screaming, slipping on his own blood, while the former queen stood calmly by the window, chatting with a priest waiting for him to die. It took nearly half an hour for him to bleed out on the palace floor. When it was over, Christina simply wiped her hands and considered the matter settled. Europe was horrified. You couldn't just murder people in another king's palace because you used to be a queen. She was labelled a barbarian, a savage from the north. Her reputation never recovered. She spent the rest of her life in Rome becoming more eccentric and isolated, a woman who didn't fit into any box the world had built for her. When she died, her body revealed one final mystery. Historical accounts and modern analysis suggest she may have been intersex or at least had physical traits that were ambiguous. It explains her deep voice, her masculine frame, and her lifelong discomfort with the role of a traditional woman. She was a biological anomaly who happened to be born on a throne. She is one of the only women buried in the grottos of St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican. In the end, she got what she wanted. She escaped the boredom of a Scandinavian marriage to live a life of high drama art and blood in the warm south. She proved that the heaviest chains are sometimes the ones made of gold, and the only way to be free is to walk away from everything you are supposed to be. Now let's leave the chaotic life of a queen who rejected perfection and travel to a small workshop in Italy where a man spent his entire life trying to achieve it. We are moving from the sound of a screaming traitor to the sound of the most beautiful music ever created. Leaving the bloody chaotic court of a queen who destroyed her enemies to find peace, we travel north, staying within the borders of Italy. We move from a palace where a life was taken with a clumsy sword to a dusty workshop where life was created with a delicate chisel. We are trading the screaming of a dying traitor for a sound so pure that people believed it could only have been stolen from the angels, or perhaps traded for a soul with the devil. Imagine standing in front of a heavy bulletproof glass case in a museum. Inside rests an object made of spruce and maple coated in a shimmering orange-red varnish. It is a violin worth an estimated $20 million. But the most haunting thing about this object is not its price tag, it is its silence. This specific instrument, known as the Messiah, has sat in pristine condition for 300 years, looking exactly as it did the day it was finished. It has never been played for an audience. It is a masterpiece that has been kept in a coma. The man who made it, Antonio Stradivari, was not a wealthy aristocrat or a famous general. He was a craftsman who lived and died in the small town of Cremona. While the rest of Europe was fighting wars and burning witches, Stradivari was fighting a war against imperfection. He spent his entire life from the age of 12 until his death at 93 hunched over a workbench, breathing in the fumes of resin and glue, obsessed with shaping wood into a vessel for the human soul. But there was something strange about his violins. They didn't just sound good, they sounded impossible. They projected sound in a way that defied physics, carrying a whisper to the back row of a cathedral. As his fame grew, so did the dark rumours. People whispered that he must have made a pact with the devil. They claimed he used wood taken from the coffins of the dead, or that he mixed his secret varnish with the blood of bats, or the dust of crushed human bones to give the instruments their eerie singing quality. The truth was less supernatural, but perhaps more fascinating. Stradivari was working during a unique period in history known as the Little Ice Age. Europe was locked in a deep freeze. The winters were long and brutal, the summers were cool. This climate anomaly had a profound effect on the trees in the Italian Alps. The spruce trees grew incredibly slowly, meaning their growth rings were tighter and denser than at any other time in history. Stradivari wasn't using magic. He was using wood that had been forged by suffering. He would venture into the forests, sometimes sleeping on the ground, tapping the trunks of the trees with a hammer, listening for the right resonance. He treated the wood like a living thing. He soaked it in a chemical bath, a cocktail of fungi minerals, and possibly fruit gum to preserve it. Modern scientists have analysed wood chips from his workshop and found traces of complex preservatives that suggest he was as much a chemist as he was a carpenter. Then there was the varnish. This was his ultimate secret. Every night after his assistants went home, Stradivari would mix the orange-red liquid behind locked doors. It was beautiful, durable, and flexible, allowing the wood to vibrate freely. To this day, despite millions of dollars spent on chemical analysis, laser scanning, and carbon dating, no one has been able to perfectly recreate the formula. It remains the Coca-Cola recipe of the music world lost to the grave. The story of the Messiah violin is the climax of this obsession. Stradivari finished it in 1716 during his golden period, but he never sold it. He kept it in his shop, perhaps realising it was the finest thing he had ever made. He died with it nearby. For centuries it passed from collector to collector, always treated as a holy relic, never as an instrument. It was worshipped but never heard. It remains the only Stradivarius in existence that is truly new, a time capsule of sound that we are not allowed to open. Today the world's greatest violinists play on Stradivari's other instruments, and they say the experience is like wrestling with a wild animal. The violin dictates how it wants to be played, not the other way around. Modern science, with all its 3D printing and synthetic materials, still cannot match the sound of those wooden boxes made by an old man in a freezing Italian winter. It is a humbling thought that the greatest technology in music is not a microchip, but a piece of dead wood from the 17th century. It reminds us that sometimes the harsh conditions we endure, like the freezing cold that stunted those trees, are the very things that make us capable of producing something beautiful. Now leaving the silent perfection of the violin, we travel to the murky waters of the River Thames in England. We are about to witness a humiliation so deep that a grown man felt the need to run into his garden and bury his cheese. Leaving the quiet reverence of a violin workshop, where a man devoted his life to building a masterpiece, we travel to the chaotic banks of a river in England, where men were devoted to destroying one. We are trading the preservation of a wooden box for the burning of wooden ships and the pride of a craftsman for the shame of a nation. We are about to witness a moment where the most valuable thing a man could think to save was not a document or a jewel, but a block of imported dairy. It is the middle of the night in London, June of 1667. A wealthy, high-ranking government official named Samuel Pepys is running into his backyard. He is wearing his nightgown, sweating, and looking over his shoulder in panic. He drops to his knees in the dirt and begins to dig a hole with his bare hands. He is not burying a body, and he is not burying gold. He is burying a large wheel of Parmesan cheese and a bottle of wine. In the distance, the sky is glowing an angry orange, and the ground is shaking with the thud of heavy cannons. This bizarre scene of a man trying to save his expensive snacks while his country burned is the perfect snapshot of the raid on the Medway. It was the lowest point in the history of the Royal Navy, a disaster born not of cowardice, but of extreme criminal negligence. King Charles II had made a fatal calculation. He was broke, having spent the national treasury on parties and mistresses. He decided to save money by mothballing the fleet, leaving the great warships unmanned and anchored in the river, assuming the peace talks would end the war. He was wrong. The Dutch, sensing weakness, decided to speed up the negotiations by sailing right into England's bedroom. Under the command of the legendary Admiral de Ruyter, the Dutch fleet entered the Thames estuary. They weren't sneaking in, they were kicking down the front door. The English defences were laughable. There was a massive iron chain stretched across the Medway River to stop enemy ships, but the forts guarding it were half empty and out of ammunition. As the Dutch ships approached the chain, a terrifying thing happened. They didn't slow down. A Dutch fireship, a vessel packed with combustibles and set ablaze, slammed into the chain. The metal groaned and snapped under the weight of the impact. The barrier was gone. The English fleet, sitting like sitting ducks in the water, was defenceless. The Dutch captains began to pick them off one by one, setting fire to the pride of the Royal Navy. But the true horror for the English wasn't the fire, it was the voices. As the Dutch ships navigated the tricky, shallow waters of the river, the people on the shore heard English accents shouting orders from the enemy decks. It turned out that the English sailors, who hadn't been paid by the king in months, had defected to the Dutch side. They were guiding the enemy ships to destroy their own fleet, shouting to their former countrymen on the shore, "We did fight for tickets before, now we fight for dollars." They were burning their own flag for a paycheck. The climax of the humiliation came when the Dutch reached the Royal Charles. This wasn't just a ship, it was the flagship of the fleet, the vessel that had brought the king back from exile. It carried the royal coat of arms on its stern. It was a floating symbol of the monarchy, and it was captured without a single shot being fired. The crew had fled. The Dutch soldiers boarded it, struck the English colours, and began to tow it away. Imagine standing on the banks of the river, watching your king's personal ship being dragged away by the enemy, while a Dutch trumpeter stood on the poop deck playing a lively tune. It was a slap in the face that echoed across Europe. The fires from the burning ships were so bright that they could be seen in London, causing the panic that sent Samuel Pepys into his garden to bury his cheese. He, like many others, thought the Dutch were going to march all the way to the capital. They didn't. Having made their point, the Dutch sailed home towing the Royal Charles behind them like a trophy. The war ended shortly after, with England forced to sign a humiliating peace treaty. They gave up their claims to the Spice Islands and were left with a bruised ego that would last for a generation. The king kept his throne, but he lost the respect of his people, who whispered that he cared more about his spaniels than his sailors. Samuel Pepys eventually dug up his Parmesan cheese. It was fine, but the reputation of the Royal Navy was rotten. The stern peace of the Royal Charles is still on display in a museum in Amsterdam today, a permanent reminder of the time England forgot to pay its bills and lost its flagship to a tow truck. Now let's leave the smoking wreckage of the English fleet and travel to the Jewish quarter of Amsterdam. We are trading the noise of cannons for a silence so heavy it felt like a physical weight. We are about to witness a man being completely erased from his community while he is still alive. Leaving the museum in Amsterdam, where the stolen stern of the English flagship hangs as a trophy of war, we walk just a few blocks away into the heart of the city's Jewish quarter. We are trading the booming cannons of the Dutch Navy for a weapon that makes no sound but cuts much deeper. We are about to witness a different kind of execution, one where the victim is allowed to keep breathing but is stripped of his soul, his family, and his name. Imagine a young man standing on the steps of a synagogue in the dim light of evening. He is 23 years old, quiet and unassuming. Suddenly a figure in a dark cloak lunges from the shadows. A dagger flashes in the moonlight, aimed directly at the young man's heart. The young man twists away just in time. The blade misses his flesh, but slices through his heavy velvet coat. The assassin flees into the night. The young man Baruch Spinoza would keep that torn coat for the rest of his life, a reminder that his questions were dangerous enough to kill for. The year was 1656. The Jewish community in Amsterdam was a group of refugees. They had fled the fires of the Spanish and Portuguese Inquisitions, where they were burned alive for their faith. They had finally found a safe haven in the Netherlands, but they were terrified. They were a traumatized community that believed their survival depended on strict unity and obedience to God. They could not afford a heretic in their midst who might bring down the wrath of the Christian authorities or the judgment of heaven. But Spinoza was a prodigy who could not stop asking questions. He looked at the Bible and saw a text written by men not dictated by God. He looked at the universe and said that God and nature were the same thing, that God was not a grandfather figure in the sky, judging our sins, but the very substance of existence itself. To the elders of the synagogue, this wasn't just philosophy, it was a radioactive contagion. They tried to bribe him with a pension of 1,000 florins a year just to keep his mouth shut. Spinoza refused. So the elders initiated the herem, the ultimate ban. On July 27th, the synagogue was filled with a heavy, suffocating silence. Black candles were lit, the Ark of the Torah was opened. The chief rabbi stood before the congregation and read the most terrifying decree in the history of the religion. It was not a simple expulsion, it was a total spiritual annihilation. The words of the curse were specific and brutal. They called upon the angels and the saints to destroy him. Cursed be he by day and cursed be he by night. Cursed be he when he lies down and cursed be he when he rises up. Cursed be he when he goes out and cursed be he when he comes in. The Lord will not spare him, but the anger of the Lord and his jealousy shall smoke against this man. As the final words were spoken, the black candles were inverted and extinguished in a bucket of blood-red liquid, plunging the room into darkness. The social consequences were immediate. The decree forbade anyone from speaking to him, reading his writing, or doing him any kindness. Most famously, it stated that no one could come within 4 cubits, about 6 feet of him. It was a social distancing order that lasted a lifetime. His own family turned their backs on him. He was erased from the community, as if he were already a corpse rotting in the ground. Spinoza did not fight back. He did not scream or beg. He simply accepted the banishment with a chilling calmness, reportedly saying, "This compels me to do nothing that I should not otherwise have done." He changed his name from the Hebrew Baruch to the Latin Benedictus, both meaning blessed. He packed his things and moved to a small apartment, making a living by grinding lenses for telescopes and microscopes. There is a tragic poetry to his new profession. Spinoza spent his days in a room filled with floating glass dust, shaping lenses to help other people see the world more clearly. But while his mind was unlocking the secrets of ethics and the universe, his lungs were slowly filling with microscopic shards of glass. The silica dust cut into his tissues day after day, a physical mirror of the way he had cut through the superstitions of his time. He died at the age of 44, his lungs destroyed by the very tools he used to seek the truth. He died alone without a funeral service in a rented room. But his work survived. The Ethics was published after his death, becoming a cornerstone of the Enlightenment. The man they tried to silence became the voice of modern reason. The curse of the synagogue was never formally lifted. To this day, the ban remains on the books. But Spinoza proved that you can be cursed by every man on earth and still find a kind of holy peace in the solitude of your own mind. Now for our final story of the night we leave the quiet tragedy of the lens grinder and travel to the warm waters of the Mediterranean. We are going to a fortress on an island where the war didn't last for a day or a year, but for an entire generation. Leaving the quiet, dust-filled room in Amsterdam where a philosopher died alone to free his mind, we travel south to the sparkling blue waters of the Mediterranean. We are trading the invisible walls of a social curse for the very real, very thick stone walls of a fortress. We are moving from a man who was exiled from his people to a city that was exiled from the rest of the world for an entire generation. This is the story of the longest siege in recorded history. A battle so long that it ceased to be an event and became a way of life. Imagine being a young soldier, 20 years old, standing on a rampart, holding a musket. You look out at the horizon, but you don't know what a forest looks like. You have never seen a river flow freely through a valley. You have never walked in a field of wheat. You were born inside this fortress. You learned to walk in the trenches. You learned to read from ammunition crates. And your first memory was the sound of a cannon firing. For you, the world is nothing but stone smoke, and the enemy waiting outside. This was the reality for the defenders of Candia, the Venetian stronghold on the island of Crete. In 1648, the Ottoman Empire arrived to take the island. They quickly captured the countryside, but the fortress of Candia was a masterpiece of military engineering, a star-shaped puzzle of thick walls and deep ditches. The Ottomans laid siege to it, expecting it to fall in a few months. Instead, they stayed for 21 years. It is hard to wrap your mind around that number. 21 years is not a battle. It is an era. Inside the walls, life became a grotesque parody of civilization. The food ran out early, the defenders ate horses, then dogs, then rats, and finally they boiled the leather of their boots, just like the pirates in Panama. But the hunger was the easy part. The psychological terror was the real weapon. The Ottoman army, frustrated by the stalemate, turned the siege into a laboratory of horror. They used biological warfare. When a plague broke out in the Turkish camp, they didn't burn the bodies. They cut off the heads of the victims, loaded them into catapults, and launched them over the walls into the city. Imagine walking down the street and having the rotting, disease-ridden head of an enemy soldier crash through your roof. It was a reign of death designed to spread sickness and madness. The ground beneath the city was as dangerous as the sky above. Both sides dug a labyrinth of tunnels. It was a war of moles. The Ottomans would dig under the walls to plant explosives. The Venetians would dig counter-tunnels to find them. Men would meet in the pitch blackness of the underground, fighting to the death with knives and teeth in spaces so tight they couldn't turn around. If a mine exploded, the ground would simply swallow whole companies of men, burying them alive in a tomb of dirt and stone. For 2 decades, all of Europe watched Candia. It became a symbol of resistance. French nobles and German knights travelled there as if on a crusade, eager for glory. They would arrive in their shiny armour, launch a brave, foolish charge against the Ottoman lines, get slaughtered, and leave the survivors to rot in the fortress. The veterans of Candia looked at these tourists of war with weary eyes. They knew that heroism didn't matter here, only endurance did. The end came not with a bang, but with a betrayal. After resisting for a generation, a Venetian engineer named Andrea Barozzi defected to the Ottoman side. He was tired, bitter, or perhaps just broken by the endless war. He gave the enemy the blueprints of the fortress, pointing out the weak spots in the walls and the exact location of the water supplies. The impregnable city was suddenly naked. The Venetian commander Francesco Morosini looked at his starving troops and the crumbling walls. He had just 3,000 men left, capable of fighting against 60,000 Turks. He made the hardest choice a soldier can make. On September 27th, 1669, he didn't charge into a glorious death. He surrendered, but he negotiated a surrender so dignified it felt like a victory. The defenders were allowed to march out of the city with their weapons, their families, and their honour intact. As the Venetian ships sailed away from the harbour, leaving the smoking ruins of Candia behind, the silence must have been deafening. The cannons that had fired every day for 21 years finally went cold. The Ottoman army entered the city, but there was no cheering. They had lost over 100,000 men to take a pile of rubble. It was a victory, but the cost was so high that it marked the beginning of the end for Ottoman expansion in Europe. It serves as a final heavy reflection for our nights. Humans are capable of enduring the impossible. We can live in a hole in the ground for 20 years, eat leather, and fight off plagues driven by the sheer refusal to give up. But it also begs the question, at what point does the cost of holding on become higher than the price of letting go? The rain is still falling outside, perhaps a little softer now than when we started. The world is dark and quiet. You have travelled through 20 lifetimes, witnessed fires, plagues, betrayals and miracles. Now it is time to let those stories fade back into the mist. Take a deep breath. Feel the weight of your body sinking into the bed. You are safe here. The doors are locked. The shadows in the room are just shadows. The only thing that matters now is the sound of your own breathing and the rhythm of the rain. I hope you found something in these stories that will stay with you, a strange fact, or a moment of courage to turn over in your mind as you drift off. If you enjoyed this journey into the dark, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. It helps more than you know. Next time we will open a new file. We might look into the strange disappearances in the national parks, or perhaps the cold unsolved mysteries of the deep ocean. But until then, keep your eyes open and sleep well. Good night.